first session will be by Dr. Maria Fedoryka, and she'll be speaking about theology of the body as the foundation of marriage and the family, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. She's recently married with Roy Showman, Roy Showman, who's sitting there next to her taking pictures of this beautiful lecture. And she also recently has a book out with the Catholic Truth Society called The Gift of Woman. She specializes in ethics, realist phenomenology, and most recently is publishing and speaking in the areas of sexual ethics and the philosophy of love, exploring the manifold implications for human existence of the origin of creation in love. She received her PhD from the International Academy of Philosophy, which is in Liechtenstein, having written her dissertation, Moral Evil, Is It Really Only a Privation? The Ontological Ground and Reality of Moral Evil, under Dr. Joseph Seifert. So let's welcome Dr. Fedoryka.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with you, exploring this very timely and beautiful topic of theology of the body. As Pete Colosi said, I'm going to look at the relationship between what John Paul II does in this marvelous meditation on the spousal relationship between man and woman and the coming to be of the family. And in fact, I'd like to read to you, start with a quote that we find towards the end in 124. He says, "The theology of the body, particularly as a pedagogy of the body, in some way plunges its roots into the theology of the family, and at the same time leads to it. This pedagogy of the body, whose key today is Humanae Vitae, can be explained only in the full context of a correct vision of the value of life and family." So as we know, in fact, what prompts the Holy Father to write this meditation is actually the prohibition against contraception as it's portrayed and developed in Humanae Vitae. But the vast majority of the audiences actually meditate on the relationship between husband and wife. Okay, so that's obviously very interesting. And if we think about it, we see that Humanae Vitae mostly emphasizes the negative, the prohibition. We may not separate fruitfulness from union. And in fact, also at the end of the theology of the body, there's the same emphasis on the negative, but you also see the positive dimension, namely that if you really understand the union between man and woman, you'll understand that in some way, not only will the spouses refrain from artificially separating the meanings, but they will actually hasten to, in a sense, enter into the fruitfulness of their love. Right? So what I want to do today is I want to explore some of the foundational elements that you find in the theology of the body, that if they are really unfolded and really followed through, then you'll see that actually family is in some way the culmination of what John Paul II is doing in this work, right? So you see what I mean, that it's not just sort of, you don't end on a negative note, well, we shouldn't separate the two, but in fact, they're intimately related, and for spousal love to fully be itself, it has to include fruitfulness and will want to include fruitfulness. And I'm going to have 5 sections in my paper. And I want to first look at the nature of the relationship between the body and soul. And in all of John Paul's meditations on the family, he always includes at least some mention of the relationship between body and soul. This is very, very foundational, very fundamental for him. Secondly, I want to look at how this body-soul relationship reveals the vocation of the human person. Thirdly, I want to examine the special nature of sexuality in this vocation and how it reveals the vocation to love. Fourthly, I'm going to briefly look at the language of the body, and I'm going to then end with a meditation on love and how that reveals to us that the family is actually really you could say, the crowning glory of the relationship between the husband and wife. Okay, so the body, the first section, the body reveals the personal spirit. So in his major reflection on the family, in Letter to Families and in Familiaris Consortio, John Paul II spends some time establishing as foundational to his considerations on family the truth that the body, along with the personal soul, is in some real sense the person. In other words, the body is really constitutive of the very being of the human person. We don't simply have a soul that occupies the body. The body is the person. We already heard that emphasized in other talks. And something very unique, very marvelous occurs here. In a sense, the boundary that otherwise exists between spirit and matter, you could say, is traversed and penetrated. Body and soul, spirit and matter actually compenetrate, to use the word of Benedict XVI, to form one single being. We have something entirely unique here. Okay? So this leads us to two very important truths. Firstly, as John Paul expresses in many famous passages from the Theology of the Body, the human body in its very being and structure is capable of expressing the person. The body is, as he says, transparent to the immaterial reality of the soul, making it visible in another order of being, in the material order. And Donum Vitae tells us, it's a beautiful quote that I'd like to also include here. By virtue of its substantial union with the spiritual soul, the human body cannot be considered as a mere complex of tissues or organs and functions, nor can it be evaluated in the same way as the body of animals. Rather, it is a constitutive part of the person who manifests and expresses himself through it. It's the end of quote. And secondly, this unity between the body and soul in the person, this entails that the person, when he acts in his body, does not use it as an instrument. Rather, the body enters into the being of the human person as subject and becomes a co-subject with the person in his activities. Right? So if I use a pencil or a hammer, right, it's an instrument in my hand. When I use my body, and we speak of using my body, it's not an instrument that I use, it's really I who am acting and living through my body. So in paragraph 7.1, John Paul II writes, Man is a subject not only by his self-consciousness and by his spiritual and by his self-determination, but also based on his own body. End of quote. Okay, the second section, the body reveals the call, the vocation to live love. So John Paul II asserts that the body reveals the person, but then he goes on to say that the body also reveals the vocation of the human person. More specifically, it is the body in its masculinity and femininity that constitutes a special revelation of the deepest vocation of man, the vocation to love, and more specifically to spousal love. Masculinity and femininity, as complementary, indicate an ordination of the man and the woman to each other, an ordination of total giving and full reception of the other. And he says in section 14, the body which expresses femininity for masculinity and vice versa manifests the reciprocity and communion of persons. It expresses it through gift as the fundamental characteristic of personal existence. End of quote. So masculinity and femininity, we could say, have their origin in an invention of God to serve the plan of a uniquely profound and intimate love. So for the purposes of our topic, we need to note the following. The deepest meaning of the body is found in its spousal characteristic. It is in spousal union that the deepest gift character of the body is fulfilled. And so John Paul says in 15:1, the human body with its sex, its masculinity and femininity, seen in the very mystery of creation, contain from the beginning the spousal attribute, that is, the power to express love, precisely that love in which the human person becomes a gift and through this gift fulfills the very meaning of his being and existence. End of quote. Okay, so if we think that everything that exists must have some reason, John Paul II is telling us what the reason for the existence of the body is. Right? The grounds, the deepest reason for its existence, right, is this spousal, mutual self-giving of husband and wife in marriage. So although the body is used in many ways by us to give ourselves to others, the deepest way in which we, quote-unquote, use the body is in the spousal relationship. So this is true of both marriage and then also, of course, of virginity, in which the sphere of sexuality is sealed off in a unique way and consecrated to God. Okay, and in addition to revealing man's vocation to love, John Paul repeatedly states that masculinity and femininity themselves reveal the human person's origin in love. And this is another important point that we have to note. Okay, the body is a witness. The body and the vocation that it reveals is a witness to man's origin in love. He says the very fact of masculinity and femininity witness to the person's having been created out of love. And he writes in 14:4, quote, created by love, that is, endowed in their being with masculinity and femininity. He says, man and woman are created by love. That is, endowed in their being with masculinity and femininity. And then further on he says, this is the body, a witness to creation as a fundamental gift, and therefore a witness to love as the source from which this same giving springs, end of quote. So what we conclude here is that the vocation of man and woman to spousal love emerges as the vocation to reflect, and we'll later see to participate in, the being of God. God who is love and whose life is made up of a substantial love that finds its culmination in a distinct person within the Trinity, right? The Father and the Son, the love between the Father and the Son, it gives rise to the Holy Spirit. God overflows, as it were, in his love into the being of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so the third section now is the sphere of sexuality, and I want to look at it as the special locus of this deepest realization of spousal love. So while masculinity and femininity are first and foremost spiritual characteristics, we know that they are inseparable from the body. It is the incarnate, embodied person alone who is properly male and female, right? Angels have no gender, even though they appear to us as male. So now, while everything in the human person is characterized by masculinity or femininity, the sphere of sex contains a special culmination of gender. Right? We have a special concentrated locus of masculinity and femininity in the sexual sphere. So it isn't surprising then that sexuality is somehow at the very center of the mutual love between man and woman that is called spousal. So we have to first briefly reflect on the nature of the sexual sphere. So we have to first recall here what was said earlier, namely that the body is taken up into the personal soul. Right? The human body is quite different from the other matter that we encounter in the world. It's already personalized. It exists as personal. It's stamped with the personal soul. But within the body-soul unity, we find, mysteriously by God's invention, that the sphere of sex contains a special intersection of body and soul. There's an especially close unity of body and soul that is found in the sexual sphere. Okay? And we experience this when we see that any entrance into the sexual sphere automatically involves the spirit, right? People want to talk about casual sex, but that's impossible. Whenever we enter into the sexual sphere, the spirit, the soul is taken into that. Okay, so and this experience witnesses to an important truth about the structure of the sexual act as unique among bodily acts. Okay, when I wave my hand, there's no intrinsic meaning to this, right? I could be saying hello, or I could be a spy and telling a fellow spy that he should do something or leave or whatever, right? The meaning is actually arbitrary, okay? The meaning is given to it by us from the outside. But sex by its very nature is an entirely different kind of bodily act. The conjugal act is an act which does not consist merely in physical movements or gestures, but by its very nature is structured to contain an act of the spirit. This means that as physical, the conjugal act is not complete by itself. Rather, it's one dimension of a two-dimensional act, the second dimension of which is spiritual. Okay? And John Paul II speaks of embodiment. Literally, a spiritual act is made bodily in the conjugal act. You see that? So when we use a word, we point to some reality, right? If I say rose, you think of a rose. Or if I give you a rose, it indicates that I love you, or I like you, or I'm fond of you. But in sexuality, I don't point to something else beyond the sexual act. It is the act of love, right? Love is actually contained. And so here we have, in the conjugal act, you could say a two-dimensional act, one that is bodily but also necessarily and essentially involves the spirit. And we know what that spiritual act is. It's the act of love. Right? Love isn't symbolized in the sexual act, it's actually lived in the sexual act. Now this means that even though the conjugal act is bodily, exists in the realm of matter, unlike in the case of other material reality, all of its laws are a direct expression of a spiritual reality. The natural laws or physical laws that govern sex are hence quite different in their constitution, their metaphysical structure, than are the physical laws found in other realms of man's bodily existence. And even more from the laws governing the activities of the animal world and even of animal reproduction. The physical laws in the realm of human sexuality are the manifestation of the reality that sex is ordained to embody. Namely, it's a manifestation of the reality of love. So to anticipate, we must mention more specifically that sex embodies both dimensions of love, union and fruitfulness. Okay, so by comparison with the physical laws governing the sexual sphere, the physical laws of nature are a world apart. They're only a very pale reflection of these laws. In fact, we should say that they're more dissimilar than similar. So this point is at the very center of the theology of the body. In Love and Responsibility, Carol Wojtyła writes that everything depends on that. That's a direct quote. Understanding that this is the special nature of the sexual act. It means that the biological laws found in the sexual sphere are not primary, but they're governed by, they're determined by a spiritual reality superior to themselves. Right? They are what they are because, if you will, the spirit spills into the realm of matter and makes them be what they are. And this is why John Paul can say in a rather astonishing statement, he says, quote, "The inner structures of organism, of somatic and psychosomatic reactivity found in the sphere of sex are an expression of masculinity and femininity." Right? The very inner energies of the spousal act reflect and embody masculinity and femininity. Right? And therefore, he says, they can enter into the dialogue of persons. We'll see more about that later. Right? And it is only because of this that we can even speak of a theology of the body. Right? If the spousal act weren't imbued with the spiritual meaning, it wouldn't really be possible for us to speak of a theology of the body. Okay. Fourthly, I'd like to briefly reflect on the language of the body. It's a term that everyone is very familiar with, so I'll just briefly look at it. So this understanding of the body and of sexuality is at the foundation of the concept of the language of the body. The fact that the body and the soul are one, and that the spousal act in particular is knitted together with a spiritual meaning, is why the body has the power to unite persons. And he uses that language, the power to unite persons, and not only bodies. There are passages from the theology of the body that are justly famous, in which John Paul expresses this marvelous truth that the body not only points to or indicates the communion of persons, but actually constitutes it. He says, quote, "In this way, the perennial and ever-new language of the body is not only the substratum, but in some sense also the constitutive content of the communion of persons." It actually makes up the communion of persons. John Paul goes further and specifies that God's invention of the human spousal relation is such that love cannot be realized without the body. To quote, this is in section 104, paragraph 7, "Yet man is in some sense unable to express the singular language of his personal existence and vocation without his body. He is constituted in such a way from the beginning that the deepest word of the Spirit, words of love, gift, and faithfulness, call for an appropriate language of the body, and without this language of the body cannot be fully expressed." End of quote. And in 105:6 he says, "In this sense, man, male and female, do not merely speak with the language of the body, but in some sense he allows the body to speak for him and on his behalf." That's rather remarkable. The body speaks for the person. And he says, "I would say in his name and with his personal authority." End of quote. So once again, let us focus on the key point for our discussion here. We see that it's not simply that man is made up of body and soul, and so he needs to involve his body in all of his acts and in his spousal union. In God's mysterious plan, it is specifically the spousal self-giving that has, in some sense, the body as its special locus. Right? So the body plays a very central role in the spousal communion of persons. It is, of course, the body as animated by the personal soul, but it is nevertheless the body that has a special role to play. This is reflected, for example, in the fact that, technically speaking, the vows themselves are not sufficient to render a marriage indissoluble, but only the consummation of the marriage in the spousal act. And John Paul says it's in and through the body that marriage becomes a sacrament of the indissoluble union between God and man, between the church and the members of the church. Okay, so this is the fifth and last section, which is the longest section. It's going to involve a sort of reflection on love and going to culminate in how the family is really central to the theology of the body. So we've seen that the person is called to living the gift and that the body is that which is constitutive of the conjugal love culminating in marriage, is central to this vocation. Our next task is to examine closely how this sheds light on the nature of the communion between the spouses. Another way of stating our next task is to ask the following question. If the body has a language, what is it more exactly that it says when it speaks spousally? Right? We already generally answered that this is love, but now we need to look at this more closely. So I want to begin with a very important quote in section 19, 3-4. Man appears in the visible world as the highest expression of the divine gift, because he bears within himself the inner dimension of the gift. And with it he carries into the world his particular likeness to God, with which he transcends and also rules his visibility in the world, his bodiliness, his masculinity or femininity. Thus, in this dimension, a primordial sacrament is constituted, understood as a sign that efficaciously transmits in the visible world the invisible mystery hidden in God from eternity. End of quote. So the body and its special act of communion and spousal love communicates to the world the invisible mystery of God. Even more, the human person truly participates in this mystery. So he doesn't only reflect the mystery, but he actually participates in it. And what is this mystery, he says? He asks, this is the mystery of truth and love, the mystery of divine life in which man really participates. So St. John tells us the deepest secret of God's existence. He is love. Not only one who loves, but his very being is love. So through the revelation of Christ, we know that the very identity, this was already said by John Crosby, the very identity of the persons within the Trinity is constituted by mutual self-donation and mutual reception. In and through the substantial self-giving of the Father and the Son, the love between them becomes once again substantial in the being of the Holy Spirit. So love is the ground of life within the Trinity, and it's the very ground of being within the Trinity. Just as love is the ground of life within the Trinity, it is everywhere and always the origin of creation, which in fact is pure gift. So he writes in section 16, the reality of the gift and the act of giving, which is sketched in the first chapters of Genesis as the constitutive content of the mystery of creation, confirms that the irradiation of love is an integral part of this same mystery. Only love creates the good, and in the end, it alone can be perceived in all its dimensions and contours, in created things, and above all, in man. End of quote. So to understand the nature of the language that is spoken in the exchange of persons in and through the body, spousal language, we have to understand the nature of love. I want to briefly look at that. So in its innermost core, love is union. Right? When love is accomplished, two persons come to belong to each other. Right? They share a third common space. Right? Each one, you could say, becomes the center of the other person's existence. Right? So we normally identify love primarily with union. Each lives no longer for himself, but for the other. Each doesn't belong to himself anymore, he belongs to the other, and thus they become one being. But just as integral to union is another element that belongs to love, and that is the element of fruitfulness. The unity of two persons is such that by its very nature, this unity overflows, and it gives rise to some reality beyond itself. It is extremely important. We could say the very law that governs love is the law of superabundance, right? If the union isn't more than itself, if it doesn't culminate in more than itself, it's not really love that's present. Okay? And we experience this even in friendship, but especially in spousal love, how the soul comes to new life, right? It bears fruit within the soul. Right? There's never a deadness in the soul in love, but on the contrary, a sort of new life. Okay, so we see that union and fruitfulness are two dimensions that make up the one reality of love. We can't separate them, right? So we can't speak of union being love and then say that somehow fruitfulness is external to this. Both are internal to the reality of love. Okay, and to briefly look at how they're related, union has priority from the causal point of view, right? Union comes first. It's the origin and source of fruitfulness. On the other hand, fruitfulness is where the union of love reaches its completion. The union of itself, paradoxically, is itself. Union is itself only if it goes beyond itself and is created. If there's no overflow present in the union, then you can be sure it's not a union of love. And so in 123:4, John Paul actually tells us that each depends on the other. The one is realized, quote, the one is realized together with the other, and in a certain way, the one is realized through the other. So they mutually seem to entail each other. So what does all of this mean for the spousal act? Okay, here we need to briefly summarize what we already in part covered. So as we saw, the soul of marriage is the spiritual reality of love, which is realized in the context of embodied persons. Further, we saw that on the basis of their embodiment as masculine and feminine persons, the human spouses discover within themselves a unique power for unity in the conjugal act. Though the union of persons in love is a spiritual reality, because the body exists as taken up into the personal soul, this act of the body truly makes real the personal unity of the spouses. The spiritual reality, we could say, stamps the bodily being of the spouses, such that the body can now be the agent of unity. It actually makes them one. It actually accomplishes the unity. But the spouses discover something else, and here we're beginning to come to the crux of my argument, that the bodily act of union is also stamped with the other dimension of love, with fruitfulness. The spouses discover that by God's design, the pinnacle of the expression of spousal union contains also the pinnacle of the other dimension of love, the pinnacle of fruitfulness of spousal union. That is the coming to be of a new human person. It is here that spousal love has reached its completion and overflowing into its fruit. The love between the spouses has become substantial, as it were. Love has expanded into a new agent of love, which in turn expands the circle of love for the husband and wife, now become father and mother. And this is why Gaudium et Spes speaks of children as the ultimate crown and supreme gift of marriage and of marital love. So the elements that our analysis has put together reveal that even if conception does not result from every act of intercourse, the full meaning of the spousal exchange between the couple is found only in the concept of parenthood. The coming to be of the child cannot be understood as a mere consequence of the union, standing in a sort of external relationship to the union. Rather, the child stands in an integral relation to the unity of the spouses to each other. We could say the child is, in a sense, internal to the love between the parents. And here also we discover the true depth of spousal love. It is a love so great that its fruit is nothing less than the creation of a new human person. We could almost say that we find in the child a sort of physical correlate of the spiritual fecundity of the union. Okay, and it indicates how great the love is, how deep a love it is, that it can actually produce a new human soul. And so John Paul II says in Familiaris Consortio, we know that this document is very dear to him. He says, fecundity is the fruit and the sign of conjugal love, the living testimony of the full reciprocal self-giving of the spouses. Okay, and with this we come to the heart of my paper. It is in and through the body, the personalized body, and through the body alone that this particular kind of fecundity becomes possible. Something wonderful occurs in the connection between the spousal act and the coming to be of the child. So earlier we saw that the physical matter of the human person is raised up to become personal, right? The soul communicates something very special to the matter of the body. But now we see that the body actually does something similar for the soul. It actually expands the capacity of the soul. Right? We normally think of matter as being somehow inferior to the soul, and here we see something very remarkable. In fact, the spirit gains an entirely new possibility because of its connection to matter. Okay? The Swiss theologian Martin Ronheimer writes, quote, through the spirit, the body acquires a new dimension, but then he adds, through the body, the spirit also acquires a new dimension. And in Deus Caritas Est, we find a very remarkable statement that I didn't really understand at first, and I've come to understand much more now. He says the following, this is in paragraph 5, quote, Christian faith has always considered man a unity in duality, a reality in which spirit and matter compenetrate. And here's the line that's so remarkable, and in which each is brought to a new nobility. Both are brought to a new nobility through this union. The soul, the spirit, is raised to a new nobility. So here in the most exalted moment of love between human persons, we also find the most exalted meaning of the human body. Through it, the human person can participate in the creative love of God. The body thus becomes a sign and a sacrament that would have been unimaginable for us did we not witness it, did we not actually see it. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, the love between the Father and the Son. The child proceeds from the love between the husband and wife, between man and woman. In Familiaris Consortio, we find this beautiful formulation, quote, with the creation of man and woman in his own image and likeness, God crowns and brings to perfection the work of his hands. He calls them to a special sharing in his love and in his power as creator and father through their free and responsible cooperation in transmitting the gift of human life, end of quote. So I would venture to say that maybe here we have found the most foundational reason that God has given man a body, right? Maybe, in fact, this is why he created matter to begin with. Because of it, and because of it alone, man can actually be a procreator. So an angel cannot communicate itself. It can't give a part of its spirit, a part of its soul, to give rise to another human creature, right? And we can't create out of nothing. But we can actually share part of who we are in the bodily dimension of our being, right? And really, I mean, insofar as we are our bodies, mother and father, husband and wife really communicate themselves when they co-create, right? They infuse themselves into this new being the way the Father and the Son infuse themselves into the being of the Holy Spirit, right? And now the child is really part and parcel of the love between the parents, which is, in a sense, bursts the bonds of the communion. It's so great, and it overflows into the being of a new human person. Thus it becomes apparent that if we do not continue to speak of the significance of family within marriage, we have only completed a partial theology of the body. So what we're saying here illuminates what the Church has meant in holding that children are the primary end of marriage. The soul of marriage is the spousal love that finds its fullest expression, its completion, say its culmination, its perfection, in its own proper fruit, the coming into existence of a new human person. Right? Since the child is a pure gift And since the spouses do not directly bring about the existence of the child, there's an element of surprise, right, that this should proceed from their union. But if they experience the true meaning of the extraordinary reality of mutual self-donation, in which each spouse really lets go of himself and gives himself to the other, surrenders himself, as John Crosby said, if they really enter into that experience, they won't remain surprised that another human soul should, you could say, be produced from this extraordinary mutual communion. Right? The child is a sort of irradiation of their love. In Love and Responsibility, Carol Wojtyła says, thanks to the willingness for parenthood, both persons in the union act in accordance with the inner logic of love. They respect its inner dynamic and prepare to accept a new good, an expression of the creative power of love. End of quote. Okay, so where genuine spousal love exists between a husband and wife, where they truly and purely enter into the spousal intimacy, their unity will, by its very nature, you could say, hasten to the establishment of a family. Right? If the love is truly love, it'll, in a sense, insist on bearing fruit. Okay, and I want to just close with briefly reflecting on how it is that man and woman can actually enter into an experience of this. Because, in fact, because of the fall, there's a sort of disintegration of body and soul that takes place. Right? So the fruitfulness that's written into the spousal meaning of the body, the sense of that is lost, right? Because we could say we've lost touch with our bodies, right? And so husband and wife don't deeply feel, because of the wound of original sin, that the body, their union, should be fecund. But in fact, John Paul II says it is possible for husband and wife to experience subjectively the deep unity between the union and the fruitfulness of love. So he says, a chaste human love that is transformed by the love poured into the heart by the Holy Spirit through the sacramental life of the Church has sufficient power not only to bring the couple to obey the teacher's churching on family, but for them to experience its rightness in their, he says, in their very psychosomatic subjectivity, which is very extraordinary. Right? Their body, they actually experience the fruitfulness of their body in their very subjectivity. They don't just know it from the outside. Okay? He says, in knowledge we attain, in the knowledge that we attain of the body, he says, it actually takes it out of the realm of passive matter. Right? And we become aware of its spousal characteristic in both its dimensions. So I want to just read a quote. He says, in everything that is determined by both body and sex, knowledge inscribes a real and living content. Consequently, knowledge in the biblical sense signifies that man's, quote, he puts it in quotes, biological determination on the part of his body and his sex is no longer something passive, but reaches a level and content specific to self-conscious and self-determining persons. Therefore, it brings with it a particular consciousness of the meaning of the human body bound to fatherhood and motherhood. The spouses can become conscious of their meaning of their body as capable of fatherhood and motherhood. So I'll just end with a beautiful quote, which I think represents the positive, you could say the positive realization that the love between the spouses should end, somehow culminate in family. He says, if conjugal chastity manifests itself at first as an ability to resist the concupiscence of the flesh, it subsequently reveals itself as a singular ability to perceive, to love, and to realize those meanings of the language of the body that remain completely unknown to concupiscence itself. And this chastity progressively enriches the spousal dialogue of the couple by purifying, deepening, and at the same time simplifying it. Thank you.
I start with one question and then the second question.
Thank you for shielding me from Michael Wallstein.
My cannon is ready.
So there was a question earlier that maybe you could. I think you brought it up in your talk, but could you, from the standpoint of that beautiful relation you just described, explain again how it is true that that when conception doesn't happen, this all is still important and therefore can't be used as an argument for contraception or anything, and just how it relates to people who are, whatever, not fertile and so forth.
Well, I think maybe the first thing to say is, from the point of view of my paper, it's a great sadness for a couple that, for whatever reason, can't conceive, right, and can't have a family. So that's the first thing I want to say. And I'm not sure I completely understood your question. You're saying, why is it that one can enter into the spousal relation even if no conception follows?
Show the importance of that even when there's not an actual child.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that would actually require some development, because the point is the following. What you have is a spiritual act with very specific characteristics, right? Love, union, and fruitfulness. What God has done is He has created a physical act which actually literally makes bodily this reality. So you have to say, well, can we then do one thing or another with that physical act that God created to embody that reality? The answer very quickly is seen, no. If this act, this particular act, is the bodily correlate of this spiritual act, it can only be used in such a way that it actually reveals this structure. And so what I actually have in this talk would be a foundation for marital chastity, which is another big question that I don't think we're discussing it here. But why is it that even couples that are beyond the fertile period may not use the act in any other way? Right? There are certain things that are absolutely forbidden by the Catholic Church. Right? Certain ways of using the act. And you say, why is that? Well, because we see that a very particular physical structure and particular physical action and gestures and even, but postures, very mysterious, reflect a spiritual reality. Okay? And this would be the foundation for answering your question. Okay, well then in all cases, if we don't actually live that gesture, we're doing something else. And he says, it's probably something lustful going on. Right? So it would be a little bit like saying, once we determine that waving my hand means hello, I can't mean anything else with it. If we say, for now on forever, this is going to mean hello. Right? I can't just decide that I'm going to do something different, right? Or that I'm going to use it in a different way. So does that help to... Yeah.
You can call on your people.
Okay.
Yeah, I very much liked your talk. It seems to me that in it you remain faithful to the principles of Dietrich von Hildebrand, but carried his argument a decisive step and an important step further. That is, you remain faithful to the principle which he holds, that the union of love is the primary intrinsic meaning of the sexual act and of marriage. And then he speaks about children as the primary end. Sometimes it sounds a bit detached, but what you have done is connect the two very beautifully. What I'm wondering is whether you have given enough space to the nature of the sexual act itself, or whether it isn't still too much perspective from above, as it were, from the spirit, giving a certain meaning to the material reality. Although, toward the end of your argument, when you talked about how angels can't do that, you indicated that the superabundance that lies in love can be realized in human beings exactly because they're bodily, and an act can take place in them which has the power of procreation. So I wonder whether you wouldn't be then willing to take one final step in that direction and agree with what Wojtyła says, for example, in Love and Responsibility, where he says the Church teaches and has always taught that the primary end of marriage is procreation, and he identifies end and meaning. So that's a real disagreement with Hildebrand at that point. That is that procreation or children are the specified end of the Conjugal Act, so that if you ask, what is that act? The answer is, it is in its nature, always, whether a child comes from it or not, a procreative act. And it's unitive in a secondary sense, in the sense that that is not what constitutes the specific nature of that act, but it's a further attribute.
I'll just...
That's Wojtyła's position, I take it, and I wonder if you go all the way there.
Well, I want to maybe refrain from saying whether I agree with Wojtyła, because I would have to probably read the text again to be more clear myself on what he says there. And what I've done is mostly focus on the theology of the body and try to sort of build my argument on the basis of all the pillars that he gives there. And I'll just very briefly say I would agree that the institution of marriage was established in order for family to come into being. In other words, in order for human love to actually flower into the coming into existence of new human souls. That's what marriage is. That's why it was established. The only thing that I want to point to is, yes, but what is at the origin of the coming to be of new human souls? Love, love, and love again. And I want to firmly put together fruitfulness and union within the spousal meaning of the body. I don't want to say the body has a spousal meaning and connected to it is also fruitfulness. I actually want to say that the fruitfulness is part of the spousal union, the spousal meaning of the body at its fullest flowering. So, and maybe we can talk more later. Yes?
When couples experience infertility, they very often have a very strong understanding of that need to express that fruitfulness and pass on their own bodily self towards that. How would you go about when a couple with that issue comes to you, that they don't then go down the IVF pathway, and you're wanting to discourage that there's also other means? How would you?
Yes, it's a very, very good question, a very important one, and I think actually probably deserves a session in and of itself, so I'll plan the next Theology of the Body conference with that in mind. But it would also, again, probably take a lot to answer that, but I'll very briefly say, this is part of the reason why I actually like, you heard Dietrich von Hildebrand mentioned, because he speaks of the child specifically as related to the union as fruit, as an overflow, and therefore as a gift. Right? It's something that is ultimately a gift. And we would also have to bring in the fact that the human soul is actually created by God. So there's never complete ownership of what is happening here. The spouses, in fact, don't ever experience the fertilization, right? I mean, that happens beyond the act itself, which is very interesting, right? So it's not actually intrinsic to the exchange of persons, the conception itself, right? You could say the imparting of the sperm is, but not the conception itself. That's something that really is a gift, and it's given by God. And I would probably emphasize that. You would have to bring into the argument the fact that every human soul ultimately has its origin in God, and not in the life of the spouses.
The answer that I get back, the answer that I get back is that in an artificial conception, God is still creating that soul too.
Yes, but the point is here what's happened is that the child as the fruit of the love, and this is what is actually key, why I so emphasize the fact that this act is an embodiment of love, right? So what does the fruit come from in every case? From the union. If we think about the spiritual nature of love, we say fruit isn't fruit unless it comes from union, right? You see the intrinsic connection. And we say here's an act that literally makes that real, and it has a very specific structure. So if you make the fruit occur outside of the bodily union, what have you done? You've actually really, in some way, destroyed the structure of the way in which human existence comes, the human soul comes into existence. And I just want to very briefly add, I can also see the theology of the body as a meditation on, John Paul II is saying to himself, what kind of act can stand at the origin of the creation of a new human soul? It's almost as though he's bowled over. What act is sacred enough, right? What act is, you could say, safe enough, right, for a new human soul to come into existence? And I think this, as a specific act of love, which has a specific structure, if we break that structure, we say, that is no longer a fruit of love. Right? And I think that there's some heavy metaphysical stuff there, but I think that's what you would have to say. That's why I emphasize the embodiment of this act of spiritual act. Yes?
Thank you. It was interesting that in 1997, when there was the Vade Mecum for confessors on spiritual direction for the married couple, Pope John Paul commissioned a further work, which is lesser known from the Council for the Family, and that was a series of theological essays exploring the mystery of Eucharist and reconciliation within the marital sacramental identity of a couple. And one of those essays, which was written by a Jesuit, I can't remember, unfortunately the book's only in French, it's not in English, he said that when the spouses come together in the loving union, open to life, of course, absolutely essential, he likened that unto the priest at the altar during the celebration of the Eucharist, invoking the Holy Spirit upon the bread and wine prior to the words of institution being announced. In other words, what he was saying was that even when the sexual union does not come about with the conception of a child, because it's in the minds of the spouses to be open to life, there is nevertheless a layer of fruitfulness that is, in a sense, wholly spiritual and actually contributes to the Eucharistic life of the domestic church, the home, and therefore the church.
I think it's a very, very beautiful reflection, very beautiful meditation. The only thing is, when there's a couple that's experiencing the very particular pain of not having a child, I would be careful about saying that too quickly to them. I think the first thing we have to do is minister to their pain, but understand, because they really are feeling the specific fertility of this act. But I think that's very beautiful and should be incorporated into the pastoral care. And we have one more.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. I'm wondering if one of the difficulties we get ourselves into this question of infertile couples is that we seem to locate the union in the spouse and the life-giving in the child. But one of the points you made is that wherever there's love, it gives life, and wherever there's love, it's fruitful. So, isn't it also the case that when a couple outside the fertile period engage in the marital act, they give life to each other as well as uniting with each other? And when a child is conceived, it unites with them as well as having received life. And so the point is, love, whatever love is, it unites and gives life.
Yes.
And so
That's right.
in the words that Jesus said in his relationship with his Father, he said, I draw life from my Father, and my Father and I are one. So isn't that really what couples are saying in the marital act outside the time of fertility? That they're drawing life from each other and they're uniting. So even at that point, the marital act is fruitful. It's fruitful for them.
Yes.
And it's also uniting. And at the time of fertility, it becomes supra-fruitful and supra-uniting. And it's kind of therefore like the words of Christ at the Eucharist when he says to the apostles, this is my body for you. And then he went beyond and said, this is my lifeblood for all. But I think the problems emerge because we limit unity, we kind of separate unity and fruitfulness out. We say unity is for the spouse, fruitfulness is for the child.
That's right.
But in fact they're always present.
Yes. No, that's absolutely right. Thank you for that comment. That's part of, I think that's what I was trying to do in this talk, is to actually show that fruitfulness belongs to the spousal meaning as well, which is primarily union, but then which culminates really in the fruitfulness. Yeah, so I have a question here.
Hi. So I'm actually the product of donor conception. My parents never met. I have no idea who my father is. My mother had no idea who my father was. And I have a little bit of a problem with when your parents were never in love, and in this way, I feel like breaking it down so that if couples just love each other enough, they'll be rewarded with a child. Whereas I think the parents loving each other is really a gift and a necessity for the child. It's such a torment when your parents never loved each other and didn't commit to each other. And so I'm just having a real problem as like the child is the little prize you get when you love deep enough.
See, I'm not sure. I see a question there. Would you mind just stating your question again, or?
I guess it was more of a comment. Just can you talk more about what the child is owed versus?
Yes. Okay.
Ways of expressing fruitfulness without just the child being the only expression of fruitfulness between a couple.
Oh, you're saying what are the other kinds of fruit that you can find, or?
And what other ways can couples express their creativity besides the child, and what is the child owed in terms of its parents?
Okay. So I think in the to the first, obviously the love is actually a spiritual act, and even in the union of bodies, it's the expression of the spirit. So obviously the fruitfulness that occurs is very much on the level of the spirit, right? The husband and wife grow, and it's very beautifully contained in Theology of the Body in the section on the gift, the way in which new life comes to the spouse is through this exchange. She speaks of the spiritual fruitfulness without actually using that word. So that's right. But I think the thing is, marriage is a very special institution whereby the bodies of the human persons are actually involved, and it has a very special kind of fruitfulness that we have to recognize and say, the fruitfulness of marriage that's very special and very unique is the coming to be of the child. So, but with respect to the second, you said what the child is allowed to expect and what are the rights of the child. And I don't know if you've heard of this document called Donum Vitae. I think you would very much appreciate it. It's actually a document on the question of artificial forms of conception. And one of the main points that Donum Vitae makes is, first of all, that the child is a gift, and that the parent should not appropriate that gift, but receive it. And then the document considers, well, what does this actually mean for the physical conditions of conception, and if the child is a gift? And it emphasizes that it has to be the direct fruit of the love between the parents. That the child, in justice, in strict justice, has the right to be conceived in a particular act of love between man and woman, husband and wife, so that the child's rights are actually being primarily safeguarded, right? Obviously, the love between the parents suffers too, but here it's talking primarily about the rights of the child. And I don't remember if anybody knows where this is written about. I don't know if the document includes it or not, but that in one of these documents it says, nevertheless, even if the child is conceived outside of a particular act of love, God, who is love and the origin of all persons, is there loving this child into existence. So you have the act of love, which is the wellspring of existence, right there, right at the moment of conception. So I don't know, did that address it a little bit, or? Yeah. Right here.
If the child is conceived outside marriage, does that change? Does the nature of that conception change? Or I know biologically it doesn't, but meanings or how the church would perceive the position of the child, or or there is a lack of a role of the family.
Yeah. Well, this is emphasized over and over that once the child comes into being, the dignity is the same, and the rights of the child to love are exactly the same, to respect and so forth are exactly the same as the child that's conceived within a marriage. So does that answer the first part of your question there? That there's no difference between the child, the being of the child that's conceived within marriage or outside of marriage. But on the other hand, there's some sense in which the rights of the child have been violated, because every human person has the right to be conceived in really you would say the context that the Creator intended, which is really an act of love. And in fornication or adultery, there's you could say the biological nature of the act doesn't change, but in some sense the form of the act has changed, and you really have an act of lust in some way, and the child then is the fruit of that, which again is a kind of denial of the rights of the child. Question?
I'd like to have your views in terms of a couple that's using natural family planning due to the exhaustion of the couple with their conditions. There's more help, less help from grandparents, family, friends, etc., diseases. If a couple that is using this and that has, for instance, to postpone the new kids for like 1-2 years, when they are having they are open to life, but they are trying to have their encounters, their sexual acts, has the church says, but outside the fertility dates, where they know that by observing the woman's body that she will be fertile. When they are doing that and trying to pray if they should have this child or not, when they do this, do you think that this is correct or not? Natural family planning.
Well, it's a very big question. Let me actually just simply say this: the Church allows for natural family planning, and she specifies, if you read Humanae Vitae, for grave reason, the couple may postpone having children or not have children at all for grave reasons. So. Yeah, and I think that maybe it's more than we can get into here, but obviously the idea is generous. The hearts of the parents should be generous, and we see that in documents too. That's one of the big criteria. But we have a question right here.
I just wanted to ask, what about people wanting to remarry or marry the first time, kind of like when they're clearly past their fertility?
Yeah.
Is that,
yes.
Good or bad?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing about the spousal act, is that it precisely does have two meanings, and unlike generation in the animal world, the only reason that animals ever come together is in order to procreate. There's only one meaning. But with respect to human generation, the child is the fruit of another act that already has an integral meaning in and of itself, which is the act of union between the couple. And so the Church has always taught, even if there's no possibility of having children, because of this second meaning of the spousal act, it is legitimate. Marriage is legitimate, and spousal relationship is legitimate in that context. Does that help? Yes. Okay. We have a couple here.
Just wondered, how do we speak about the unity of the body and the soul without falling into that dualism, which regards them as two things, two sort of different things?
Mm-hmm. Are you asking for sort of what would be the language that we use, or?
Yeah, you talked about. I think you quoted Benedict XVI saying, "In the body, spirit and matter compenetrate." But maybe could you unpack that a bit?
Well, there's the classical formulation of Thomas Aquinas, where the soul is the form of the body, and I don't know if you're familiar with scholastic language, form and matter. Yeah, so you have the metaphysical principle that makes a thing be what it is called the form, and then that which is shaped and becomes something is the matter in the case of the material thing. And Thomas Aquinas uses the language of form and matter, so you can see that there would be a very deep unity. I have some reservations about that formulation because the soul also has its own substance. It also transcends the body, right? Its reason for being isn't just to make matter be alive, right? There are many acts that we perform that transcend the role of the body. So I have some reservations about that. But I would simply say this, that there's some sense in which we probably can't fully exhaust it or find language that's really perfect. But the language of compenetration, I think, is very, very apropos. And I speak of the physical matter of the human body as having an interior metaphysical space. Again, that's philosophical language that it would need to be chewed through. And it's this, only the spiritual soul can fill it. And then it becomes animated and enlivened from within by the Spirit. But I maintain that they don't actually disappear as being separate principles. And that's why I'm saying it's very astonishing, and we have to marvel at it. There's some sense in which, in the body-soul unity, the boundary between spirit and matter is somehow, you could say, made very weak, and they actually come together to form one being. I don't think I can do better than that right now, but yeah. Yes? Yeah.
It has a language, and it has in love. Persons become one, and the vow, which I think is the seventh commandment, it says, what God has put together, let no man pull asunder. Now this practice, I have practiced for 35 years, when I was a young girl like yourself, and still today, we want this to be improvised in the same way. This one union, whether they're making babies through IVF or other things, that child or that making is still a creation from God. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If that was just a comment, I didn't really discern a question there.
It's not a question, it's a question and a comment, because the commandment says, what God puts together, let no man pull asunder. That's what we make in the marriage vows.
Okay.
You can slightly change them, but the basis is that. And your talk on ethics is the same meaning. I'm saying it to you in layman's terms. You're telling me in philosophical terms. Do you agree or not?
Maybe we can talk after the session and I can understand a little more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.